So if you can tear yourself away from the current extremely stupid discourse about whether or not a very good, but at this point very much this side of overpraised blockbuster deserves to join the dubious ranks of Academy Award also-ran nominees because apparently Disney bought a We Deserve Award Season Respect 2 kit for this year and they're going to use it for one of the movies.
That's what the money is for!
Perhaps you can hold some of that discerning outrage in reserve for projects that more likely ought to generate nominations and might even have a decade ago, but have a decent chance at ending up overlooked in the 2020s because nobody but Disney knows how to market and release a movie anymore. Case in point, Joe Wright's Cyrano, a light and breezy period dramedy featuring beloved actor Peter Dinklage in a leading role as a fast-talking romantic action hero who dazzles with wordplay, gets in sword fights, pours his heart out in romantic prose, does spy missions as a soldier, and sings ballads because this is also a musical based on one of the all-time classics of Western literature, though here retooled into somewhat more modernized vernacular English and present-tense sensibilities. Kinda seems like the sort of thing that should be promoted as a bigger deal, right? Like if you were a movie executive and one of your already-in-the-can projects was everybody's favorite actor from Game of Thrones as a swashbuckling hero in a project that falls somewhere between Princess Bride and Bridgerton tonally, you'd probably say, well, shit, that's at least a mid-level moneymaker, right? Get that out sometime other than late January and actually promote it.
What are you doing here, you beautiful thing, when you could be making me a mint? Hey fellas, start shooting!
Hooray!
But late January is when this is apparently going wide, following a limited awards qualifying run earlier in December. It was actually made over a year ago, but you know, that whole plague thing happened, so it's probably going to have to count on word-of-mouth attraction. Fortunately, it happens to be really good.
Well, whoever said this studio is totally lacking in artistic taste?
You did on your show last week.
How awkward.
Like I said, in another era, I feel like this is the kind of thing a competent studio would have marketed to a solid mid-tier hit if they'd actually wanted to, just on the concept of star vehicle for Peter Dinklage, a legit name-above-the-title movie star whom audiences genuinely love, but what do I know, I'm just the critic. In any case, this is a feature version of a 2018 off-Broadway musical adaptation, which also featured Dinklage, adapted from Edmond Rostand's 1897 play Cyrano DeBergerac, which is one of those Western theater canon deals that you've definitely heard of, or at least know the story from, even if you don't necessarily know it was, like, called that. Set in 1640s France, this is the one about the guy, Cyrano DeBergerac, who's basically the coolest fucking dude in the world. He's a top-tier soldier, a master swordsman and street fighter, a gifted poet, songwriter, musician, dancer, smart, funny, charming, just total package peak human dude, who also happens to be the best friend since childhood of the hottest single girl in the city named Roxanne. But when it comes to Roxanne, Cyrano has permanently friend-zoned himself via crippling insecurity over his physical appearance, believing himself too ugly and misshapen to be worthy of a great beauty. This is further complicated when he learns that Roxanne believes she has fallen in love at first sight with Christian, a classically handsome soldier in Cyrano's own battalion who feels similarly for her but is waylaid by doubts of his own. Roxanne is an intellectual and lover of poetry and art, and Christian, though a decent dude, is basically a well-meaning dumbass who can barely string two words together. Wanting to help both of them, Cyrano agrees to ghostwrite love letters to Roxanne on Christian's behalf, which ends up working too well. The whole thing gets a bit out of hand, and yes, this is what Roxanne, the half of it, and every other thing with the same storyline was based on.
Oh, that's what that is.
The classical version of the story has been filmed several times prior, though it's hard to call any staging for the screen definitive. It's always been a hard nut to crack by nature of the setup being so specific for the stage. The whole thrust of the plot turns on the audience needing to suspend disbelief that Cyrano himself could be simultaneously this quintessential romantic hero figure, but also so recognizably a figure of physical ridicule in some way that even he'd diminish himself in a fashion that would communicate clearly and constantly to a live theater audience. Traditionally, via the text of the original Rostand play, this was accomplished by describing Cyrano as having been born disfigured by his abnormally large nose, and having the actor portraying him typically sport an exaggerated prosthetic as part of his costume, an effect which works well enough as a theater prop, but less so in a live-action feature, where big nose is kind of a razor-thin line to hit as visualization goes between cartoonishly silly and so subtle you can't really grasp what the big deal is supposed to be. So the film, you've no doubt gathered by now, opts to forego this issue entirely by way of the same ingenious casting as the stage version. Dinklage plays Cyrano, sans any facial prosthetics, and with only piecemeal extra dialogue acknowledging reference to the obvious fact of his own stature within the reality of the story's world, and thus the source of the character's insecurities are transferred to something more apparent and palpable. This version of Cyrano, while even more so the vibrantly heroic figure on screen whenever he appears, is aware of how the world sees him, and fears even the chance Roxanne might reject him as well, or worse, that the world's ridicule of him might be transferred onto her. It's a masterstroke of smart casting, though not without risk. If the material doesn't measure up, you run the risk of reducing Dinklage's substantial talents to mere typecasting, but it pays dividends given how hard the interpretation leans into the tragicomic absurdity of DeBergerac's skewed self-image. Even if audiences hadn't been pre-sold on this particular actor as a generational megatalent, it's impossible to watch Dinklage's version of Cyrano burst onto the screen in the first act in a whirlwind introduction that opens with stand-up comedy roast, transitions into dramatic reading, then into a musical number, and ends with a sword fight and not come away thinking, oh, so this is just the coolest guy who's ever lived, and then immediately sympathize with his one sad, relatable hang-up and get invested in the rest of it. Like, you get why he feels like he does, but also you keep saying, dude, I get it, but, tell her, you're like the most awesome guy. If she doesn't see it, screw her.
You sold money, don't know it.
But then they wouldn't be doing Cyrano DeBergerac. And it certainly helps that the rest of the cast comes together nicely. Kelvin Harrison Jr. puts a sweet, sympathetic spin on Christian, Bashir Saladin gives a winning voice to Cyrano's confident Libret, Haley Bennett invests Roxanne with a lot of depth, something the adaptation is clearly interested in expanding on versus prior interpretations, so that the okay fine, screw her thing doesn't become an issue. And hey, even though circumstance and human frailty are really more the villains of the piece in this case, you do kinda need a bad guy to twirl a mustache for these things, if only for the ambiance, and Joe Wright definitely knows his ambiance, so they went and got Ben Mendelsohn. I mean, who else can you ask for that part? If the film does have a mild shortcoming, it might be that the music for this musical isn't necessarily what you'd call show-stopping. That's not to say it's bad. I'd actually say the songs range from good to very good, and there's at least one or two that feel like they'd have become out-of-context standards in this had it been an on-Broadway production. The music and lyrics are all from Aaron and Bryce Dressner of The National, but it's also an older-style, non-wall-to-wall musical where there are good stretches of the story with conventional dialogue rather than every scene being a song number, and it'd be fair to say that it doesn't feel like there's a chart-topping single in the bunch as presented, but taken as a whole, it has the general sensibilities of a Renaissance-era Disney musical version of its own story, which isn't exactly a bad angle to shoot for in this genre. As is, though, it's likely to be received as a star vehicle for Dinklage primarily, which is appropriate and deserved and delivers in that regard. If you didn't already know that this is one of the great actors of his generation, this would function as a handy resume in its own right, and beyond that, it's a supremely entertaining piece of filmmaking that deserves a much bigger audience than it's been marketed to so far. In my opinion, it's one of the better films of its type this year, so I'm going to call this one a 9 out of 10. Definitely check it out when it opens in your area. Feels like it came out of nowhere, but really, really impressed by this one. Check it out.